Every so often a society comes apart, not slowly and not from the bottom. A kingdom that had been stable for a century puts its king on trial and cuts his head off. A country that had been the envy of Europe starts feeding its own lawyers into a machine in the public square. An empire loses 20 million people to a civil war that began in a village schoolroom. And in every single case, afterwards, the survivors say the same thing. Nobody saw it coming. That is not true. It was seen. It was in fact counted, because underneath every one of these collapses there is a single number. And it is not a mysterious number, and it is not a hidden one. It is a ratio, sitting in the dullest documents a state produces. Enrolment registers, degree awards, admissions lists, wage tables, boring administrative arithmetic that a clerk could have added up on a quiet afternoon years before the first shot was fired. In 1640s England, that ratio was climbing. In 1780s France, it was climbing. In Qing China, it had been climbing for 200 years. It is climbing right now in the United States. And the Federal Reserve Bank of New York publishes it every 3 months. Get comfortable, because by the end of this you are going to be able to calculate that number for the society you live in, and for yourself, and you will not be able to unknow it. Before we start, the Patreon behind this channel is called Meridian Labs, and it carries this show and a handful of others like it. You get ad-free episodes across every channel in the group, early access before anything goes public, and the full research archive behind each one. Subscribe or join if you haven't. Let's start where it started. In the spring of 1837, a village schoolteacher in Guangdong province walked out of an examination hall in the city of Guangzhou, having failed for the 3rd time, and collapsed. He had to be carried home. 60 miles on a bamboo litter by hired bearers back to a farming village called Xiuquan, where his father and his brothers had spent years of pooled money and pooled hope on him. He was 23 years old. He was the only boy in the village who had ever been considered clever enough to try, and when they laid him down in the family house, he did not get up again for 40 days. What happened over those 40 days is one of the strangest documented episodes in the history of the 19th century, and I want to be precise about it, because the details matter. He was, by the accounts of his cousin and his family, in a condition somewhere between delirium and catatonia. He shouted. He ran through the house. He described being carried up into the sky by figures he could not name. He described a chamber, and in the chamber, an old man with a golden beard who wept and told him that the world had been overrun by demons, and who handed him a sword. He described a middle-aged man, whom he addressed as elder brother, who taught him how to use it. When he came back to himself, he could not explain any of it, and neither could anyone else, and so the family did what families do. They cleaned him up. They decided he had been ill. He went back to teaching children characters for a few coins a month. And 6 years later, in 1843, he sat the examination for the 4th time, and failed for the 4th time, and came home. And this time, he did not collapse. This time a cousin handed him a Christian missionary tract that had been sitting unread on his shelf for years, a pamphlet by a Chinese convert named Liang Fa, and he read it, and everything in the 40 days snapped into focus. The old man with the golden beard was God. The middle-aged man who called him brother was Jesus Christ, which made him, Xiuquan, the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to Earth with a sword to exterminate demons. The demons were the Qing dynasty. What followed was the Taiping Rebellion. It ran from 1850 to 1864. It took the city of Nanjing and held it for 11 years as the capital of a rival kingdom. It fielded armies in the hundreds of thousands, and the most commonly cited death toll for it the figure you will find across the standard scholarship is somewhere between 20 and 30 million people. 20 to 30 million. I want you to hold that number against something, because on its own it is just an abstraction, and abstractions do not do the work I need them to do here. The First World War, all of it, every front, every year, all combatants, military and civilian, killed roughly 20 million people. The Taiping Rebellion is in that range, and it was one civil war in one country in the middle of the 19th century, and it was started by a man who failed a test. Now here is the part where you expect me to tell you that this is a story about a madman. That is the version that gets told. Xiuquan, the lunatic who thought he was the brother of Christ, a freak event, an outlier, a psychiatric case study that happened to have a body count. And that version is comfortable, and it is useless, and it is also almost certainly wrong, and the reason it is wrong is that Xiuquan was not rare. He was one of hundreds of thousands. The examination he failed was the Imperial Civil Service examination, the system by which the Qing dynasty selected the men who would run it. And the thing about that system, the thing that nobody mentions when they tell you the story of the madman with the sword, is that it was designed to fail almost everyone who entered it. At the lowest rung, the county-level licentiate degree, the pass rate in the 19th century ran at something in the order of 1 to 2% of candidates. At the provincial level, the level Hong kept failing, it was worse. Millions of men across the empire spent their entire lives preparing for these exams, memorizing the classics, practicing the 8-legged essay, sitting the test at 20, at 30, at 40, at 60. There are records of men in their 80s still sitting for the licentiate, and the overwhelming majority of them, the crushing statistical majority, would never pass and would never hold office, and would spend their lives in the specific and corrosive condition of being educated far beyond anything their society was prepared to give them. The Qing did not have a madman problem. The Qing had an arithmetic problem. They were manufacturing hundreds of thousands of men every generation who had been told by the state, in the state's own official language, that if they studied hard enough they could rise. And the state was not lying. Exactly. The ladder was real. It was just that the ladder had a fixed number of rungs, and the number of people climbing it had been growing for 200 years, while the number of rungs had not. And that gap, the gap between the number of people qualified to rule and the number of positions available to rule from, is a number. You can compute it. You could have computed it in 1837. Somebody with the census figures, the examination registration lists, and the establishment tables of the imperial bureaucracy could have sat down in a room in Beijing in the year Xiuquan collapsed and worked out, to a reasonable order of magnitude, how many furiously disappointed classically educated men the empire was going to be carrying around by the middle of the century. Nobody did. And that is the thing I have not been able to stop thinking about, and it is the reason this script exists, and it is the question that is going to sit underneath every single thing I tell you for the next 2 hours. Because the surplus is countable. It was countable in Qing China, it was countable in Stuart England, it was countable in France in the 1780s, and it is countable now in the United States and in China and across most of the developed world, and the numbers are not hidden, and they are not classified, and they are not fringe. They are published. Quarterly, by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, among others, in documents that anybody can download. The count is going up, and in the entire recorded history of the phenomenon, across every civilization that has ever produced more qualified aspirants than it had positions to give them, there is not a single clean case of a society looking at that number, understanding what it meant, and stopping. The question then is not whether it is happening. The question is why nobody has ever, in 4,000 years, managed to see it coming and act. I have a theory about that. It is not a comfortable one, and to get there, I need to take you through a great deal of arithmetic, 4 centuries of history, 2 scientists whose careers were both nearly destroyed by this idea, and 1 document published in the journal Nature in February 2010 that named a specific decade in advance and got it right. But before any of that, I need you to understand something about the room Xiuquan was sitting in when he failed. It was not a room. It was a compound the size of a small town, and it was built out of thousands of identical brick cells, and every single one of them was occupied. The provincial examination compounds of Qing China were among the strangest pieces of architecture human beings have ever built, and almost nobody outside of specialist historiography has ever seen a photograph of one. They were fields of cells, row after row after row of brick alcoves, each one roughly 3 feet wide and 4 feet deep, open at the front, with 2 board slots in the side walls. You put 1 board in the lower slot, and it was your seat. You put the other board in the upper slot, and it was your desk. If you needed to sleep, you took the upper board out and laid it across the lower one, and that was your bed, and you were a full-grown man sleeping in a brick box 3 feet across. You were locked in for the better part of 3 days at a stretch. You brought your own food, your own ink, your own bedding, your own chamber pot. The doors of the compound were sealed and guarded. There were watchtowers, because cheating carried penalties that could extend to your family. Men died in those cells. There are records of candidates dying during the examination and of the bodies being passed out over the wall, because the compound could not be opened until the session was complete. And they came back. That is the part I keep turning over. Having done that once, having sat in a brick box for 3 days composing essays in a rigid 8-part form on passages from Confucius, and having failed, they came back and did it again 3 years later. And again. And again. Xiuquan did it 4 times over 16 years. He was not unusual in that. He was unusual only in what he did afterwards. Because here is the arithmetic that produced him, and I want to lay it out carefully, because this is the first time in this story that a human catastrophe is going to resolve into a ratio. At the bottom of the ladder were the candidates for the Shengyuan degree, the licentiate, the entry-level qualification that made you formally a member of the scholarly class. Estimates of the number of men holding that degree in the 19th century run into the hundreds of thousands, and the number sitting for it at any given cycle was very much larger. Above that was the Juran degree, awarded at the provincial examinations, the ones held in compounds like the one in Guangzhou. And above that, at the top, was the Jinshi, the metropolitan degree, taken in Beijing, which was the actual gateway to serious office. The number of Jinshi degrees awarded across the whole empire in a good year was in the low hundreds. Low hundreds. For a country of, by the middle of the 19th century, something on the order of 400 million people. Run the shape of that funnel in your head. Hundreds of thousands of men holding the first degree. A few thousand holding the second. A few hundred a year passing the third. And an imperial bureaucracy whose total number of substantive posts, the actual jobs, the actual positions of authority, with an actual salary and an actual seal, numbered around 20,000 for the entire empire. 20,000 chairs. Hundreds of thousands of men trained, credentialed, and psychologically prepared to sit in them. That is not a difficult calculation. That is not a hidden variable. That is a ratio you could have written on the back of an envelope with the government's own published figures, and the answer it gives you is that the Qing state was running at enormous expense a nationwide industrial process for the manufacture of highly literate, highly organised, deeply humiliated men. And the Taiping Rebellion was not the only thing it produced. The Nian Rebellion, the Panthay Rebellion, the Dungan Revolt, all of them in the same window, the middle decades of the 19th century, the period the Chinese historiography sometimes just calls the Great Disorder. The century of humiliation that Chinese schoolchildren learn about today. The one usually explained as a story about opium and gunboats and foreign imperialism has a domestic ledger running underneath it that killed vastly more Chinese people than any European ever did. And the ledger is written in the arithmetic of the examination system. Now I want to correct something, because it is going to come up, and if I do not deal with it now, it will sit there and undermine everything else. The story you have probably absorbed about revolutions, wherever you absorbed it from, is that they are what happens when ordinary people cannot take it anymore. The peasants starve, the bread runs out, the workers have nothing left to lose but their chains. Poverty accumulates until it reaches some threshold and the people rise. That story is not exactly false, but as a causal account of how large-scale political violence actually begins, it fails almost every time you check it against the record, and it fails in a specific and instructive way. The poor are not the ones who start revolutions. The poor are the ones who fight in them. The people who start them, who write the pamphlets, who draft the constitutions, who form the committees, who identify the enemy, who set the date, are almost always people who were educated for a position in the existing order and did not get one. Xiuquan was not a starving peasant. He was a schoolteacher with a classical education and a village's worth of expectation on his back. And once you see that pattern, once you actually look for it rather than assuming the story you were handed, it starts turning up everywhere with a regularity that stops being interesting and starts being frightening. It turns up in England in the 1640s. It turns up in France in 1789. It turns up in Germany in the 1920s. In a form so precise and so well documented that I am going to have to spend a substantial part of this script on it, because I think it is the single most disturbing case in the entire literature and almost nobody talks about it. And in every one of those cases, the same thing is true. The condition that produced the leadership class of the coming catastrophe was visible in the numbers, years in advance. Enrolment figures, degree counts, admissions registers, wage data, dull published administrative numbers that a competent clerk could have added up. Nobody added them up. Except, eventually, 2 men, and they were not historians. One of them was a failed physicist who found the idea by accident because a professor got a bad back and cancelled a class. The other was a population ecologist who spent the first half of his career modelling the boom and bust cycles of the southern pine beetle, and who was thrown out of the Soviet Union at the age of 20 because of what his father had written. Between them, over about 30 years, they built something that most historians regard as either a category error or a heresy, and that a growing number of people who look at the actual data regard as the most uncomfortable idea in the social sciences. And in 2010, one of them published a 200-word letter in Nature that named a decade in advance, and on the face of it, got it right. Everything from here is going to circle back to a single question, and I am going to keep putting it in front of you, and I am not going to answer it, because I am not sure it has an answer. If the surplus is countable, and it has been countable every single time, why has no society in the history of the world ever counted it and stopped? Let me start with the physicist. Jack Goldstone arrived at Caltech in the autumn of 1971 to study physics. He was placed in the advanced group of freshmen, the ones considered strong enough to be pushed hard from the start, and among the people teaching him in that building at that time was Richard Feynman. By his own account, he quickly found himself at the bottom of that group. I want to sit with that for a second, because I think it is the origin of everything that follows. He was not a bad physicist. He was a very good physicist, surrounded by people who were going to win prizes, and he was clever enough to work out, quite early, that the ceiling he was going to hit was not the ceiling he had imagined for himself when he was 17. He transferred out. He went to Harvard into an honours program called Social Studies, and then into the sociology doctoral program in the late 1970s, where the intellectual atmosphere was dominated by the question of revolution. Theda Skocpol was there, writing the book that would become States and Social Revolutions. The great Israeli sociologist Shmuel Eisenstadt passed through as a visitor. Revolution was the live question, and Goldstone took it up. And then, in the autumn of 1978, a professor named Daniel Bell cancelled a course because of a bad back. Goldstone needed the money. Teaching assistantships paid, and Bell's cancellation had removed one, and the only slot left open in the department was for a course called American Family Demography, taught by a demographer named George Masnick. Goldstone knew nothing about demography. He took the job because he needed the income, and he had to learn the material in order to teach it, and that is how the theory got made. He has written about this himself, and I want to give you his words rather than my paraphrase, because the moment is too good to soften. Learning demography, he wrote, he found that the baby boom in America had created, on a smaller scale, the exact same trends he had identified as leading to revolutions in pre-industrial societies. A surge of youth open to new ideologies and widely mobilized for protest. A suddenly larger population raising the costs of everything, pressures on the labour market, and, in his own list, a major increase in higher education enrolments. He was teaching a course about post-war American families, and he was looking at the English Civil War. The book came out in 1991 from the University of California Press, and it is called Revolution and Rebellion in the Early Modern World. The subtitle tells you exactly what it is doing. Population change and state breakdown in England, France, Turkey, and China, 1600 to 1850. 4 states, 4 crises, 1 mechanism. And the mechanism, stripped down, is this. Population grows, institutions do not, and the gap between them tears the state apart. But that on its own is just Malthus with better sources, and Goldstone is not Malthus, and the thing that makes his work different is what he did next, which was to try to make the pressure countable. He built an index. He called it the Political Stress Indicator, and it has 3 components, and I want you to hold on to all 3 because we are going to be tracking them for the rest of this script. The first component is mass mobilization potential. How many ordinary people are angry and available? He builds it out of real wages, urbanization, and the youth bulge, which is to say, out of how badly the average person is doing, and how many young men there are with nothing to lose. The second component is state fiscal distress, whether the government can pay for itself, whether it is borrowing, debasing, taxing beyond its capacity, running out of room. And the third component, the one this whole story is about, is elite mobilization potential, which means, in plain language, how many people who consider themselves entitled to power are being denied it. Multiply them together, roughly speaking, and you get a number. And here is what Goldstone found when he ran the number for England. His own summary is worth quoting precisely. He wrote that the indicator was low and stable prior to the 17th century, rose sharply to a peak in 1640 to 1660, then declined, and that this gave, in his words, an excellent account for the timing and magnitude of the English Revolution. The English Civil War. The trial and execution of a king, roughly 1 in 20 adult males in England dead by the end, a casualty rate that proportionally exceeded the First World War, and the stress index that predicts it starts climbing decades before the first shot, and the single loudest component in it is the elite one. Which brings us to what was happening in the English universities in the years before everything came apart, and this is where the story stops being abstract. In 1964, in the journal Past and Present, the historian Lawrence Stone published a paper called The Educational Revolution in England, 1560 to 1640, and what he documented was an explosion. In the 1560s and 1570s, England was educating a small and stable number of young gentlemen. By the 1630s, Oxford alone was admitting more than 500 students a year, which was an all-time record, and the combined intake of Oxford and Cambridge had reached a level that England would not see again for a very long time. Stone put it in a sentence that I have not been able to get out of my head since I first read it. English higher education, he wrote, did not get back to the level of the 1630s until after the First World War, and did not surpass it after the Second. Read that again slowly. The proportion of young English men receiving a university education in the decade before the English Civil War was not exceeded until the 20th century, not the 18th, not the 19th, the 20th. Stuart England, a country of perhaps 5 million people, ruled by a monarch who believed he governed by divine right, was pushing a larger share of its young men through university than Victorian England at the height of empire. And it was doing it into a labour market that had not grown at all. The church had a fixed number of livings. The state had a fixed number of offices. The law had a limited number of practices. The universities were pouring graduates into a set of institutions whose absorptive capacity had barely changed since the Middle Ages, and the graduates were piling up. 2 years before Stone's paper, in the same journal, a historian named Mark Curtis had already named the result. His paper is called The Alienated Intellectuals of Early Stuart England, published in Past and Present in November 1962, and his argument is exactly what the title says. England had produced a class of educated men for whom there was no place. Not enough pulpits, not enough offices, not enough patrons, and these men, trained in rhetoric, in disputation, in scripture, in law, formed a pool of literate frustration that would supply the radicalism of the coming decades. For a long time, Curtis's thesis was regarded as suggestive but unproven, an elegant idea without a dataset. And then, quite recently, somebody built the dataset. A project working out of Oxford and the University of Southern Denmark went through the records of roughly 60,000 early modern English students, matching individual educational histories against individual outcomes, and asked whether the men who did badly in the job market were more likely to publish radical ideas. They were. Poor career outcomes significantly increased the likelihood of publishing radical political and religious material. Curtis was right. It took 360 years and 60,000 individual records to prove it, but he was right. And here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you about this, because it is not a modern observation, and it is not a clever retrospective reading by 20th century academics. They knew at the time. Francis Bacon, writing in his Essay of Seditions and Troubles, published in 1625, 15 years before the war, put it in a single clause. He warned of what happens when more are bred scholars than preferments can take off. Bred scholars, preferments. In other words, when a country produces more educated men than it has posts to put them in. Bacon is describing elite overproduction, by name, in the specific context of a discussion of how states fall into sedition, and he is doing it in the 1620s, and the sedition arrived on schedule. Thomas Hobbes went further. In Behemoth, his history of the Civil War, he laid a substantial share of the blame directly on the universities. He thought they had bred the disease. He thought that filling young men with the habit of disputation, of arguing about sovereignty and grace and law, in numbers far beyond what the kingdom could employ, had manufactured the war. Hobbes was a reactionary and a paranoid, and he had an axe to grind, and I do not want to pretend he was doing social science. But he was there. He watched it happen, and his diagnosis, stripped of the politics, was that England had educated more men than it could pay, and that the unpaid ones went and found something else to do with their training. They found a war. But here is where it gets worse, and here is where the whole thing starts to look less like a historical curiosity and more like a law, because the same pattern, with the same components, with the same terrible arithmetic, was about to run again, in a different country, in a different century, with a different educated class. And this time, the people who did it left behind so much documentation that we can put names to them and read their letters and follow the exact path from a rejected manuscript to a severed head. On the 5th of May, 1789, at Versailles, the Estates General of France opened for the first time in 175 years. The Third Estate, the Commons, the representatives of everybody in France who was not a nobleman or a priest, sent roughly 610 deputies. Ask a room of educated people what those deputies were, and the answer you will get, reliably, is some version of the people. Merchants, farmers, tradesmen, the rising bourgeoisie of the textbooks. Here is what they actually were. Of the 610 deputies of the Third Estate, roughly 2/3 held a qualification in law. About half of that number were practicing lawyers. A very large fraction held some form of venal office, meaning an administrative post they had purchased. Around 80 were in trade or industry, and the number of peasants among them was 0. The number of salaried workers among them was 0. The Revolutionary Assembly of the French Revolution, the body that would abolish feudalism and write the Declaration of the Rights of Man and set in motion everything that followed, was a room full of provincial lawyers. Not a room full of hungry people, a room full of qualified people. And France in the 1780s had a lawyer problem in exactly the way Qing China had an examination problem. The legal profession and the whole apparatus of venal office attached to it had been expanding for generations. The training was available, the credential was purchasable, and the number of positions of real consequence, the ones with money and status and access, had not expanded to match. You could become a lawyer in Arras. You could not become anybody in Arras. Maximilien Robespierre was a lawyer in Arras, but the lawyers are only half of it, and the other half is stranger and more specific, and it comes from the work of a historian named Robert Darnton, who spent his career in the archives of the 18th century book trade and came back with something that reads less like intellectual history than like a police file. Darnton's argument, developed in a paper called The High Enlightenment and the Low Life of Literature in Pre-Revolutionary France, published in 1971 and expanded in his book The Literary Underground of the Old Regime, is that we have been looking at the wrong writers. The Enlightenment we teach is the Enlightenment of the salons. Voltaire, Diderot, the Encyclopedia, men who were, by the 1770s, extremely comfortable. They had pensions, they had patrons, they had chairs in academies. They were, in the most literal sense, part of the establishment they are remembered for critiquing, and their critique was, by the end, a house style. It was safe, it sold. Underneath them was a second literary world, and Darnton went and found it. Hundreds of men who had come to Paris from the provinces because they had read Voltaire and believed that a man of letters could rise. They arrived with manuscripts. They found that the academies were closed, the pensions were spoken for, the salons were full, and the licensed printing trade was a cartel. And they ended up in garrets, writing pornography and libel and scandal sheets, and pirated slander for a few livres, hating everything above them with a completeness that the comfortable philosophists could not have approximated on their best day. Danton's line about this is the single best sentence anybody has written on the subject, and I am going to give it to you exactly. The crude pamphleteering of Grub Street, he wrote, was revolutionary in feeling as well as in message. It expressed the passion of men who hated the old regime in their guts, who ached with the hatred of it. And it was from such visceral hatred, he concluded, not from the refined abstractions of the contented cultural elite, that the extreme Jacobin revolution found its authentic voice. Ached with the hatred of it. Now let me put names to the garrets, because this is where the theory stops being a theory. Jean-Paul Marat was, before he was anything else, a scientist. That is not a colourful detail. That was the whole of his ambition. He was a practising physician with an aristocratic clientele. He was doing serious experimental work, and he wanted, more than he wanted anything else in the world, to be admitted to the Académie des Sciences. He ran over 200 optical experiments. He published on fire, on heat, on electricity, on light, and a substantial part of his optical work amounted to an attack on Newton, which meant that the men who controlled entry to the Academy, who were Newtonians, were being asked to admit a man whose principal claim was that their founding hero was wrong. They refused him. Repeatedly, Goethe, watching from outside, called Marat's rejection a glaring example of scientific despotism. Marat himself became convinced there was a cabal against him, and the historian Louis Gottschalk, writing about him much later, diagnosed what he had developed as a martyr complex. He never got over it. He never got in. And when the revolution arrived, it handed him, at last, a platform, and he used the platform to publish a newspaper called The Friend of the People, in which he called with escalating specificity for the execution of larger and larger numbers of his fellow citizens. The man who could not get into the Academy of Sciences ended up demanding 270,000 heads. Camille Desmoulins was a lawyer who could not practice, because he stammered so badly that he could not manage a courtroom. He climbed onto a table outside the Palais Royal on the 12th of July, 1789, and gave the speech that helped push the crowd toward the Bastille, and the accounts of that day note that in the moment of the speech, for the first time in his life, he did not stammer. 2 days later, the Bastille fell. 5 years later, he went to the guillotine, along with Danton, on the orders of Robespierre, who had been at school with him. Jacques-Pierre Brissot was Grub Street itself. A hack, a jobbing writer, a man who lived by the pen in the exact economy Danton reconstructed, and who ended up leading a faction and then losing to another one and dying under the blade in October 1793. The revolution ate them. That is the part that never makes it into the summary. The frustrated elites who made the revolution were, almost to a man, killed by the revolution they made, and killed specifically in the course of a competition between factions of frustrated elites over who would occupy the small number of positions at the top of the new order. The surplus did not disappear when the monarchy fell. The surplus was still there. It had simply moved into a new building, and the new building had even fewer chairs. I have to be honest with you here, because this is exactly the place where a script like this one usually cheats. Danton himself has spent the last several decades qualifying this argument, and in recent years he has been explicit about it. He has acknowledged that Grub Street produced reactionaries as well as revolutionaries, that the right-wing press of the revolution came out of the same garrets. That being a failed writer, did not by itself condition a man toward any particular politics. And he has been unusually candid, in a way I find genuinely admirable, about the fact that he was writing his early work in the shadow of 1968, and that there is, in his words, an aggressive, anti-elitist tone to that writing, as if at times he were a 68er protesting in the streets, which means the strong version of the claim is not available. Frustrated intellectuals do not reliably become Jacobins. They become whatever is available. Sometimes they become fascists. Hold that thought. We are going to need it later, and when we get there, you are not going to like it. But the weak version of the claim survives everything, and the weak version is enough. The weak version says that the men who did the revolution were, overwhelmingly, men who had been educated and credentialed for a place in the existing order and had not been given one. And that claim is not a theory. That claim is a count. 2/3 of the Third Estate held a law qualification. You can go and look. And it produces a problem, and the problem is the reason this entire field exists. If the pattern is real, if the surplus of qualified aspirants is the raw material of political catastrophe, then it should show up in the data of a society before the catastrophe does, not after. Before, it should be measurable, in advance, in the ordinary published statistics of a functioning state. Which means the theory makes a prediction, and in February 2010, somebody made it. Peter Turchin was born on the 22nd of May, 1957, in Obninsk, a closed scientific city about 60 miles southwest of Moscow, built around the first nuclear power station in the world to supply electricity to a grid. It was the kind of place the Soviet Union built when it wanted its best minds concentrated and supervised. His father was Valentin Turchin, and Valentin Turchin is a figure worth stopping on. He was a physicist and a mathematician who became one of the founding theorists of Soviet cybernetics, and who developed a programming language and a theory of metasystem transitions that people in computer science still cite. He was also, by the 1970s, a dissident. He wrote, he organized, he was associated with Andrei Sakharov, and in 1977 the Soviet state did what it did, and the family was expelled from the country. Peter Turchin was 20 years old. He was studying biology at Moscow State University. He left, and he did not come back, and he finished his degree at New York University, and then he took a doctorate in zoology at Duke. And then he spent about 20 years studying insects. I am not being flippant, that is his career. He is, by original training and by first reputation, a population ecologist, and he is a very serious one. His work is on the boom and bust dynamics of animal populations, voles, deer, butterflies, and, in a well-known series of papers, the southern pine beetle, an organism whose numbers explode and collapse in cycles that look, when you plot them, like a heartbeat on a monitor. His own description of this period is characteristically dry. He made his living, he has written, studying the population dynamics of beetles, butterflies, mice and deer. And then, in the late 1990s, in his early 40s, at the point in an academic career where most people are settling into the thing they will do until they retire, he stopped. And he changed field entirely, and he started applying the mathematics of population cycles to human history. There is a word for what he did next, and he made it up himself. Cliodynamics. Clio, the muse of history. Dynamics, the mathematics of things that change over time. The proposition is that history has dynamics, that those dynamics are in principle quantifiable, and that if you build a large enough database of past societies, you can test hypotheses about them the way you would test hypotheses about anything else. Most historians regard this as, at best, a category error, and I want to be fair to them, because their objection is not stupid, and we are going to come back to it and take it seriously. The objection is that history is not a system of particles, that the meaning of an event is not reducible to account of it, that when you build a database of 10,000 years of human societies and start regressing instability against inequality, what you are really doing is laundering your priors through a spreadsheet. Turchin's answer to that has always been the same. Fine. Then make a prediction and see if it comes true. He made one. In the issue of Nature dated the 4th of February 2010, on page 608, in the correspondence section, there is a letter of a few hundred words by Peter Turchin. Nature is the most cited scientific journal in the world. The correspondence section is where the arguments happen. And in it he wrote that the next decade was likely to be a period of growing instability in the United States and Western Europe. He gave his reasons in a single compressed sentence. In the United States, he wrote, there are stagnating or declining real wages, a growing gap between rich and poor, an overproduction of young graduates with advanced degrees, and exploding public debt. And he made the claim that all of these seemingly disparate social indicators are actually related to each other dynamically. And then he named a date. These cycles, he wrote, all look set to peak in the years around 2020. I want to be very careful here, because this is exactly the kind of thing that gets turned into a magic trick, and Turchin himself has spent a decade pushing back against people who want to turn it into a magic trick. He did not predict a revolution. He did not predict a specific event. He has been repeatedly and irritably explicit that what he was doing was not prophecy. His own framing, which he has used more than once, is a forest fire. You can look at a forest, measure the accumulation of deadwood over decades, and say with real confidence that this forest is going to burn. You cannot tell anybody which cigarette does it, or on what afternoon. The deadwood is the science. The cigarette is the news. He wrote a blog post in 2013 with the title essentially, "That scientific prediction is not the same thing as prophecy." He has said, of the moment he first ran his model on American data, that frankly, the results for the USA scared him, and in August 2020, he and the Russian anthropologist Andrei Korotayev published a retrospective assessment in the journal PLOS ONE. Going back to the 2010 forecast and checking it against the record, they used the cross-national time series data archive, which is a standard source, and they looked at the decade that had just happened. Anti-government demonstrations, riots, the measurable, countable, indexed indicators of socio-political instability in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Western Europe. They had increased dramatically. The paper went out in August of 2020, which was, for anybody who has forgotten, a summer of the largest protest wave in American history by some measures, in the middle of a pandemic, in an election year, 5 months before a mob assembled by a sitting president stormed the Capitol. He said the year's around 2020. He said it in 2010. In Nature. Now, what is the model that produced that number? Because a lucky guess is worth nothing, and I am not interested in telling you a story about a prophet. The model has 2 engines, and Turchin lays them out in his 2016 book Ages of Discord, and then again, without the mathematics, for a general audience, in a book published in 2023 called End Times. The first engine is popular immiseration, and it is measured by something he calls the relative wage. Not the wage divided by the gross domestic product per person, which is to say, not how much a worker earns, but how much a worker earns relative to how much the economy produces per head. It is a measure of the share. In the United States, the relative wage rose through the middle of the 20th century and has been falling for about 2 generations. The second engine is elite overproduction, and this is where Xiuquan and the Third Estate and the alienated intellectuals of early Stuart England all come back and stand in the same room. Turchin defines it as the situation in which a society produces more elite aspirants than it has elite positions. Not more elites, more aspirants. More people who have done everything they were told to do, who hold the credential, who have paid the entry fee, who have been formed by the entire apparatus of the culture into people who expect to be somebody, and for whom there is no somebody available. And connecting the two engines is the thing he calls the wealth pump. The wealth pump is a mechanism, not a conspiracy, and I want to be precise about the distinction because it matters enormously. It is what happens when the fruits of economic growth stop flowing to labour and start flowing to capital. When that happens, two things occur simultaneously, and they are the same thing seen from two ends. The bottom gets poorer relative to the whole, and the top gets richer and larger and more crowded. That second part is the part nobody expects. Elite overproduction is not caused by too many people going to college. It is caused structurally by the top of the society getting fat. When wealth pumps upward, the number of people with enough money to consider themselves elite, and to raise children who consider themselves elite, and to buy those children the credentials that elites are supposed to have, goes up. The gates get more crowded from the inside, not just from the outside. And in his phrasing, which is characteristically blunt, the wealth pump in America has been operating full blast for 2 generations. The result, on his account, is a society that is simultaneously producing more angry poor people and more angry rich people. And the second group is the dangerous one, because the second group can read and organise and litigate and fundraise and run for office and write, and knows exactly how the machine works because it was trained to operate it. Turchin has a term for what happens to the surplus. They become counter-elites. People with elite training and elite ambition who have been shut out of elite positions and who therefore have every incentive to attack the legitimacy of the entire system that shut them out, and who have the skills to do it well. A revolutionary is not a poor man with a grievance. A revolutionary is an overqualified man with a grievance and a mailing list. And here is where I stop telling you about history and start telling you about the ledger, because everything I have described so far is countable. And in the United States, right now, it has been counted, and the counts are published, and they are not classified. And nobody in a position of authority appears to have any intention of looking at what they add up to. Start with lawyers, because it is the cleanest case, and because it has the most beautiful and most horrible graph in the whole of American labor economics. Every year, the National Association for Law Placement collects the starting salaries of American law school graduates. And every year, when you plot those salaries, you do not get the shape you would expect. You do not get a bell curve, with most people in the middle and tails at either end. You get 2 humps. It is called the bimodal salary distribution, and it first appeared in the data around the graduating class of 2000, and it has never gone away. Here is what it looks like now. There is a peak on the right at around $225,000, which is the market rate for a first-year associate at a large corporate firm. And there is a much broader hump on the left, somewhere in the region of $60,000 to $100,000, which is where everybody else lives. Legal aid. District attorney's offices. Small practices. Insurance defence. And between the 2 humps there is a valley, a gap of well over $100,000, in which almost nobody lives at all, which means that the average salary of an American law graduate describes essentially no American law graduate. It is a number sitting in the middle of an empty canyon between 2 mountains, and every single person who applies to law school is looking at that number, or at some brochure derived from it, and imagining themselves on the right-hand peak. The right-hand peak is small. It is a fraction of the class, concentrated in a handful of schools, and it is more or less determined by where you went and what you did in your first year, and it is not expandable. Because the number of large corporate firms and the number of clients who can pay large corporate firm rates is finite. And the left-hand hump carries the same debt. That is the part that turns arithmetic into a life. The person on the left-hand hump, earning $70,000, took out the same loan as the person on the right-hand peak. They sat in the same lecture theatre. They were taught the same law by the same professors. And when they are 35 and doing document review at $55 an hour, with $180,000 of non-dischargeable federal debt attached to their name, they are going to have opinions about the legitimacy of the system that put them there. This is what elite overproduction looks like on a spreadsheet. Not a famine, a canyon. Now do the same thing with the doctorate. The United States awards something in the order of 50,000 new doctorates a year across all fields, and the humanities account for around 5,000 of them. Those 5,000 people have spent, typically, 6 to 9 years in graduate school, in their 20s and early 30s, in exchange for a stipend that hovers around the poverty line, in pursuit of a specific job, not a vague good outcome. A specific job. The tenure track position. The Modern Language Association publishes a job information list. It is the market. If you have a doctorate in English or in a foreign language and you want to be a professor, that list is where the jobs are, and there is essentially nowhere else. In the 2016 to 2017 cycle, the English edition of that list advertised 851 positions, down almost 11% on the previous year. The foreign language edition advertised 808, down 12%. It was the 5th consecutive year of decline, and it had taken the market below the trough it had reached after the financial crisis. 851 jobs. And that number is not the number of tenure track jobs. That is the number of jobs of any kind, and within it, the tenure track share has been collapsing for years, while the non-tenure track share, the adjunct positions, the fixed term contracts, the courses taught for a few $1,000s with no benefits and no office, has been climbing. The head of the American Historical Association, James Grossman, put the situation in terms that I find genuinely bleak in their understatement. He noted that a 50% tenure track placement rate would mean that almost half of the doctorates who were expecting to find jobs in the academy did not find them. Half of people who have spent the entirety of their 20s preparing for a single profession. And I want to be blunt about something, because the temptation here is to feel sorry for the humanities and then move on. And that would be a mistake, because the humanities are just the canary. They are the part of the credential economy where the mismatch became undeniable first, because there is no alternative market. A physics doctorate can go to a hedge fund. A history doctorate cannot go anywhere that values the specific thing it was trained to do. The humanities are where you can see the mechanism naked, without the camouflage of a private sector escape hatch. But now look at what the private sector escape hatch is doing. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York maintains a public data series called the Labor Market for recent college graduates. It is updated quarterly. It is on the internet. It is free. In the first quarter of 2026, the underemployment rate for recent American college graduates was 41.5%. Underemployment in this series has a specific technical meaning. It means working in a job that does not require the degree you have. It does not mean unemployed. These are people with jobs. 41.5% of recent American college graduates are working in jobs that do not require a college degree. In the previous quarter it was 42.5%, the highest that measure had reached since 2020. And the unemployment rate for recent graduates in that same quarter was around 5 7/10%. against a national average of roughly 4 3/10, which is a reversal of one of the most stable relationships in post-war American economics. For as long as anybody has measured it, having a degree meant you were less likely to be unemployed than the average worker. That is now inverted for the recently graduated. They are more likely. Break it down by field and it gets uglier. Underemployment for criminal justice majors runs around 66%. Performing arts around 64%. Fine arts around 59%. 2/3 of the people who trained for a thing are not doing the thing. Matthew Martin, a senior economist at Oxford Economics, put a number on the aggregate effect that I have been unable to stop thinking about since I read it. Since the middle of 2023, he said, new labour market entrants, which is to say mostly recent college graduates, have accounted for 85% of the rise in unemployment in the United States. 85% of the rise. From a group that is about 5% of the workforce. The pain is not spread across the economy. It is being absorbed almost entirely by the exact cohort that has been most thoroughly credentialed and most thoroughly promised. And they were promised. That is the part that turns statistics into fury. Nobody drifted into $180,000 of debt by accident. They were told by their parents, their schools, their government, their culture, and every graduation speech they ever heard that the path was real, that the credential was the key, that if they worked hard and got in and did the thing, there was a place waiting. The Qing told them the same thing. In writing, in the imperial edicts. Now hold that up against the other end and watch the gates close. In the admissions cycle for the Harvard class of 2026, 61,221 people applied. 1,984 were admitted. That is an acceptance rate of 3.2%, an all-time low. A few years earlier, for the class of 2021, it had been just over 5%, which at the time was considered shocking. 3%. Do the inversion. 97% of the people who considered themselves plausible candidates for the top of the American meritocracy, who had the grades and the scores and the extracurriculars and the essays and the coaching, were told no. And those are not marginal applicants. The number of high school valedictorians in the United States each year vastly exceeds the number of seats at the entire Ivy League. The rejection is not a filter for competence. Competence saturated the pool a long time ago. It is a lottery with a very expensive ticket, and the people who lose it do not stop wanting. That is the whole mechanism in one sentence, and I want you to sit with it. Because everything else in this script is a footnote to it. The system does not stop manufacturing the desire when it stops manufacturing the positions. The desire is the product. The positions are the constraint. And when the two curves diverge, what accumulates in the gap is not disappointment. Disappointment is what you feel when you fail at something you did not really want. What accumulates in the gap is a specific, structured, articulate, well-networked, well-spoken, permanently aggrieved population of people who did everything correctly and were told no by a system they can describe in detail. Turchin has a proxy for what those people do next, and it is one of the more elegant pieces of the whole model, and it is this. Watch the price of a seat. The cost of winning a seat in the United States House of Representatives and in the Senate has risen enormously over the past several cycles. The number of extremely wealthy people funding their own campaigns has climbed with it. When elite positions become scarce relative to the number of people who want them, the price of the positions goes up, exactly as it would for any other scarce good. Political office in America is being bid up like Manhattan real estate, and for the same reason. Too many buyers. Fixed supply. And when the competition for those seats becomes existential, when losing means being cast out of the elite entirely, rather than merely holding a lesser office, the competition stops being polite. Look at what has happened to the way Americans feel about each other. The American National Election Studies has been asking people to rate the political parties on a feeling thermometer, 0 to 100, for decades. In 1980, the average American rated the opposing party at just under 50, which is the neutral point. Lukewarm, by 2016, voters rated their own party at around 62 and the opposing party at around 23, and they rated the opposing party's presidential candidate at about 11. 11 out of 100. That is not disagreement. That is not even dislike. That is a number you would give to a disease. And in the same period, the ideological distance between the two parties in Congress, as measured by the standard roll call voting scales that political scientists have used since the 1980s, has widened to levels not seen since the years around the American Civil War. Every one of these numbers is public. Every one of them is published on a schedule by an institution whose entire purpose is to publish it. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York publishes Graduate Underemployment quarterly. The National Association for Law Placement publishes the salary distribution annually. The Modern Language Association publishes the job list. Harvard publishes its admissions rate in a press release and then puts it on the front page of the alumni magazine as an achievement. As an achievement. They are advertising the collapse of the ratio as a selling point. The harder it is to get in, the more valuable the thing you are selling is, which means the institution has a direct financial incentive to maximize the number of people it rejects. Which means the institution has a direct financial incentive to manufacture, every single year, the largest possible population of qualified, credentialed, humiliated near misses. Nobody is hiding any of this. That is what I cannot get past. Nobody is hiding it. It is on the internet, in a spreadsheet, updated every 3 months. The Qing had the same problem, and they had the same data, and they had no excuse either. On the 19th of March, 1853, the Taiping took Nanjing and held it for 11 years. And I want to plant something here, because it is going to come back at the end of this, and I want you to have seen it coming. Every single one of the numbers I have just given you is a measurement of a success. Not a failure, a success. Wider access to university. More people qualified for the professions. Admissions competitive enough that they are decided on merit rather than birth. A society in which more of its children than ever before are told truthfully that the top is open to them. Everything I have just described to you is what a society looks like when it is doing the right thing. Now I have to do something that I think most people who tell this story refuse to do, and I want to do it properly rather than as a token gesture. Because if I do not do it, then everything I have said so far is just a very long conspiracy theory with footnotes. I have to tell you why this theory might be wrong. And it might be wrong. There are serious people with serious arguments who think the whole edifice is a house of cards, and their objections are not stupid, and some of them I have not been able to answer to my own satisfaction. Start with the worst one, the one that goes at the foundation. The theory may not be falsifiable. This is the objection that keeps coming up in the academic reviews, and it is the one that would, if it holds, end the conversation. A scientific claim has to be able to fail. It has to specify in advance what observation would prove it wrong. And when you press the structural demographic model on this point, it has a tendency to become slippery. If instability follows elite overproduction, that confirms the theory. If instability does not follow, well, the effects are lagged, the cycles are long, the pressure is still accumulating. Wait and see. If a society has high elite overproduction and remains stable, The answer is that the wealth pump was switched off in time. If it has low elite overproduction and becomes unstable, the answer is that some other component of the index was doing the work. Turchin has an answer to this, and it is not a bad one. He points out that in a dynamically coupled system, in which population and instability drive each other with a phase lag, you should not expect a simple positive correlation between the two variables at any given moment, and that a naive correlation test is therefore the wrong test. Which is true. It is exactly true of predator and prey populations, which is his home turf, and it is the sort of thing you only really internalize if you have spent 20 years watching pine beetle numbers oscillate. But it is also, uncomfortably, precisely what an unfalsifiable theory would say. Then there is the data mining objection, and it is sharper than it sounds. The Sechet databank, which Turchin directs, codes hundreds of historical societies across thousands of years on hundreds of variables, and the accusation is that in a dataset of that size and that squishiness, with that many coding decisions made by researchers who know what hypothesis they are testing, you can find a pattern for anything. The critic writing under the name Pseudo-Erasmus has hammered this line. The charge in its most damaging form is conceptual vagueness, methodological arbitrariness, and a failure to engage seriously with the competing historical accounts of the same events. And there is a version of this that comes from the historians themselves, who point out, correctly, that the raw material Turchin is coding into his database is their work, and that they know how contested and how uncertain and how interpretatively loaded it is, because they wrote it. Then there is the definitional problem, and this one bothers me the most, because I do not think it has been answered at all. What is an elite? What is an elite position? If you define an elite aspirant as somebody who wants a position and does not get one, and you define elite overproduction as the existence of a lot of such people, and you then explain political violence by reference to the existence of a lot of such people, you have built a circle. You can find frustrated, ambitious people in every society at every moment in history. The question is whether there is a principled way of counting them that does not smuggle in the answer, and I do not think the field has one. Turchin uses proxies, law degrees, medical residencies, wealth thresholds, and each proxy is defensible on its own and none of them adds up to a definition. And when you look closely at the proxies, some of them break. The writer Scott Alexander went through ages of discord with the specific intention of checking the numbers rather than admiring the argument, and he found real problems. The clearest one concerns medical residencies. Turchin reads the enormous competition for American medical residency positions as a signal of elite overproduction, too many aspirants for too few slots. But the reason there are too few residency slots is not that American society has run out of demand for doctors. It is that the number of federally funded residency positions was effectively capped by an act of Congress in 1997, and it stayed capped for the better part of 25 years. The United States has a doctor shortage. The bottleneck is a line in a budget bill, which means that at least one of the flagship indicators of elite overproduction is not measuring elite overproduction at all. It is measuring a policy decision. And if one proxy is contaminated, the obvious question is how many others are. Then there are the counterexamples, and there are two of them that I think are genuinely serious, and neither of them has been dealt with adequately. The first is the entire Western world between 1945 and 1970. Look at what happened to higher education in that period. The GI Bill in the United States. The Robbins Report in Britain. Mass expansion of universities across the developed world on a scale that had never been attempted in human history. The number of graduates went vertical. On the strict reading of the theory, that is the wealth pump running in reverse and the elite aspirant pool exploding at the same time, and the result should have been catastrophic. The result was the most prosperous and, by most measures, the most politically stable quarter-century in the modern history of the West. Turchin's answer is that the wealth pump was switched off, that the post-war settlement, the strong unions, the high top marginal tax rates, the restricted immigration, the compressed wage structure, deliberately shoveled the gains of growth downward, so that the graduates coming out of the expanded universities were absorbed into an economy that was actually creating new elite positions fast enough to hold them. And there is something to that. The number of professional and managerial jobs in the American economy genuinely did explode in that period. The positions were real, they were not a lie. But notice what has happened to the theory in the course of giving that answer. It has stopped being a theory about the number of graduates and become a theory about whether the economy is generating positions. Which is a different theory, and a much less impressive one, because it more or less reduces to the observation that if a lot of qualified people cannot find good jobs, that is bad, which nobody was disputing. The second counterexample is the 1960s, and it is worse. The United States in the late 1960s had a colossal youth bulge, a mass of students, a rapidly expanding university system, an unpopular war, assassinations of national figures at a rate that is genuinely hard to comprehend from this distance, riots in dozens of cities, and organised political violence including bombing campaigns that ran for years. By every measure in the Structural Demographic Index, the country was in crisis. It did not have a revolution. It had a very bad decade. And then the institutions held. And the country came out the other side, and by the 1980s it was, by the standards of its own history, remarkably calm. One reviewer of End Times made this point with some force. The period from about 1962 to 1975 was at least as tumultuous as anything the United States is currently living through, and the core institutions proved durable, and stability eventually returned. The mere presence of the indicators, then, does not tell you the outcome. It tells you the pressure. It does not tell you whether the vessel holds. And then there is what I think of as the economist's objection, and it is the most sensible thing anybody says about this whole field, and it goes like this. Markets clear. If law degrees do not pay, people will stop getting law degrees, and they did. American law school applications collapsed after 2010, and the number of law schools shrank, and some of them closed. That is a market working. If a credential is overproduced, its price falls, and the supply adjusts, and the surplus dissipates. And the whole thing resolves itself in a generation without anybody storming anything. And that is a real argument, and I think it is right about the long run, and I think it is almost useless. And here is why. Because the adjustment takes a generation, and the people who are already in the surplus do not get to re-optimize. A 38-year-old with a doctorate in comparative literature, $100,000 of debt, and 11 years of adjunct teaching behind her is not a market signal. She is a person. She cannot go back and be 22 and choose differently. She will carry that outcome for the rest of her life, and so will everybody else in her cohort, and there are a great many of them. And the market clearing that eventually solves the problem for the next generation does absolutely nothing for hers except confirm, retrospectively, that she was a fool. The market clears. The people do not. And this, in the end, is the strongest form of the whole theory, and it is not a claim about statistics at all. The critics are right that the model is loose. They are right that the proxies are contaminated, that the database is soft, that the predictions are hedged, that the definitions do not hold. If you came here for a physics of history, there isn't one, and there is not going to be one, and anybody who tells you otherwise is selling something. But in 100 years of arguing about it, Not one of them has produced a better explanation of who actually starts these things. They have not explained why the Third Estate was 2/3 lawyers. They have not explained why the man who burned down Qing China was a failed examination candidate. They have not explained why the radicals of Stuart England turn out, when you finally build the data set, to be disproportionately the graduates who could not find a living. Every serious critic of Turchin will concede the pattern and then dispute the mechanism, and disputing the mechanism is not the same as making the pattern go away. The pattern is still there. It is there in the 1640s, and in 1789, and in 1850. And it is there right now in a Federal Reserve spreadsheet. And there is one more case. The one I have been avoiding. The one where a society with the finest universities in the world, the most highly credentialed population on Earth, and the deepest scholarly tradition in Europe produced a surplus of educated young men, and the surplus did not go left. In 1931, the National Socialist German Students' League won control of the National German Student Union. 1931. 2 years before Hitler became Chancellor, 2 years before the seizure of power, before the Enabling Act, before the boycotts, before any of it. The students were there first. I want to make sure that lands, because the way the story is usually told, students and universities are the last redoubt of civilization against the mob, and the Nazis are the mob, and the professors and their pupils are the ones who are supposed to hold out until they are crushed. That is not what happened. German students were an early Nazi constituency, not a late one, not a coerced one, an early, enthusiastic, organised vanguard, and they captured the institutions of student government before the party captured the state. The best work on how that happened comes from the historian Konrad Jurausch, who spent a career on the German academic and professional classes, and what he documented is a machine running across more than a century that produced the same output at regular intervals. The German states, from the 19th century onward, kept trying to widen access to higher education, which is a good thing to want to do, and every time they did it, the same sequence played out. Enrolments rose. The number of positions did not. Academic unemployment appeared. And then came what Jurausch calls the pressure for protectionist restrictions, which is to say the panicked closing of the gates, driven by a fear that is explicit in the German sources and that I find genuinely chilling to read in the original phrasing, because they had a term for what they were afraid of. They were afraid of an academic proletariat. Not a working proletariat. Those already existed and could be managed. An academic proletariat, a mass of men with degrees and no positions. Politically volatile, that is the phrase in the historiography. Politically volatile. The educator Hartmut Titze went and measured it, and what he found, running the German data across the 19th and 20th centuries, was a cycle. Overproduction of academics, then crisis, then contraction, then shortage, then expansion, then overproduction again. It oscillates, like a beetle population. And then the Weimar Republic hit it with the Great Depression. The details of what happened to educated Germans in those years are hard to read even now. A Chicago newspaper correspondent in Berlin filed a report stating that 60% of each new university graduating class was out of work. 60%. Young men who had done everything the German state and German culture had told them to do, in the country with the most prestigious university system on the planet, the country that had essentially invented the modern research university and the doctorate as we understand it, and 6 in 10 of them finished their degrees and had nowhere to go. Jurausch's assessment of the consequence is written in the dry register of professional history, and it is the most frightening sentence in this entire script. The overcrowding and unemployment of the late Weimar Republic, he wrote, led many well-educated Germans to lend a willing ear to the radical propaganda of the National Socialist affiliates. Willing, not coerced. Willing, and when the party came to power, the professions did not resist. Gerauscher's later work looks at the lawyers, the teachers, and the engineers, and what he found is that these groups, the most educated people in Germany, collaborated in numbers that are, on any humane accounting, indefensible, the lawyers. The people trained above all others in the idea that there is a law that stands above power. And once you have seen it in Germany, the cases start arriving faster than you can process them, and I want to run through them quickly, not because any one of them is decisive, but because of what the accumulation does. 1848. Across the German-speaking lands, and half of Europe, a generation of university-trained men, lawyers and doctors and journalists and philologists, produced in numbers far beyond what the small courts and small bureaucracies of Central Europe could employ, and the year the revolutions came, the assemblies filled up with exactly those men. The Frankfurt Parliament was so thick with academics and jurists that it was mocked at the time as a professors' parliament, and it was mocked accurately, and it failed, and a great many of them left for America. Russia, across the whole of the 19th century, produced a word for this and could not stop using it. The superfluous man. It is a literary category before it is a political one. It is Pushkin and Lermontov and Turgenev, and what it describes is a young man of education and ability and no function, and by the 1870s the superfluous men had stopped writing novels about themselves and started building the people's will, and in 1881 they blew up a czar. Sri Lanka, 1971, a state that had expanded free education aggressively and beautifully, that had produced a generation of secondary and university-educated young people from rural families, and that had an economy with nothing whatever for them to do. The insurrection was led by educated youth and put down with a death toll in the thousands, and it happened again, worse, at the end of the 1980s. Egypt, in the years before 2011, with one of the highest rates of graduate unemployment in the world, a state that guaranteed public sector jobs to graduates until it could no longer afford to, and then quietly stopped, and a revolution organised, in significant part, by people who could read English, use the internet, and write a press release. That is the counting technique, and I am doing it deliberately. England, France, China, Germany, Austria, Russia, Sri Lanka, Egypt, different centuries, different continents, different religions, different economic systems, different ideologies, monarchies and republics and empires and colonies, and in every one of them the same specific ingredient in the same specific position, standing at the front of the crowd with a document in its hand. Now go back and pick up the thought I asked you to hold when we were in the Paris garrets with Darnton, the one I told you that you were not going to like. Frustrated elites do not reliably go left. The theory does not say that surplus graduates become Jacobins. It says they become counter-elites. It says they attack the legitimacy of the order that excluded them, and it is completely indifferent as to the direction from which they attack it. In 1789, the available vocabulary of legitimacy attack was the rights of man, and they used that. In 1931, the available vocabulary was blood and soil and stab in the back, and they used that. The mechanism does not have a politics. The mechanism has a shape, and the shape is that a large number of highly trained people who have been told no will find whichever ideology is best adapted to explaining why they were told no, and they will get very good at it very quickly, because they were trained to be good at things. That is the abdication of authority that sits underneath the whole story, and it is not the failure of a government. It is the failure of the people who were supposed to be the immune system. The lawyers were supposed to be the immune system. The professors were supposed to be the immune system. The students were supposed to be the immune system. And in Germany, the immune system was the first thing to turn. which forces the question I have been dancing around, and I have to deal with it now, because everything up to this point is pattern, and pattern is not cause. Why does this happen? Why does a surplus of qualified people become violence rather than simply unhappiness? Millions of people are disappointed every day, and they do not burn cities. What is the actual mechanism that turns a bad job market into a body count? The best answer anybody has given is 55 years old, and it comes from a political scientist named Ted Robert Gurr in a book published in 1970 called Why Men Rebel. And the answer is that human beings do not measure their lives against zero. They measure them against what they were promised. Gurr's central concept is relative deprivation, and he defines it with a precision that is worth reproducing. It is the gap between value expectations, which is what people believe they are entitled to, and value capabilities, which is what they believe they are actually going to be able to get and keep. And his core hypothesis, stated flatly, is that the potential for collective violence varies strongly with the intensity and scope of relative deprivation among members of a collectivity. Note what that does. It severs violence from poverty. You can be poor, and if you have always been poor, and everyone around you is poor, and you expected to be poor, the gap is zero, and Gurr predicts nothing. This is why the most desperate people in history are so rarely the ones who rebel. Starving people are not revolutionary. Starving people are busy. But if you were raised to expect a professorship, and you are adjuncting at 3 campuses, the gap is enormous. Even though you are objectively far better off than the peasant has a hard life and no gap. You have a comfortable life and an abyss, and the abyss is where the violence comes from. Gurr's colleague in this tradition, James Davies, added the shape of it in a paper in 1962, and it has been known ever since as the J-curve. Davies noticed that revolutions do not happen during long periods of misery. They happen after a prolonged period of improvement that is followed by a sharp, sudden reversal. Things get better and better, expectations rise in step, and then keep rising, and then the delivery falters, and the gap between what you have come to expect and what you are now going to get opens up like a trapdoor. The most dangerous thing you can do to a population is to give them hope and then withdraw it, not deprive them, promise them, and then fail to deliver after they have already rearranged their entire lives around the promise. That is what a credential is. A credential is a promise with a price. And now put the two halves together and you have the whole of it. The masses supply the numbers, the anger, the availability. But they do not supply the leadership, because the leadership requires skills that immiseration does not confer. You cannot draft a constitution if you cannot read. You cannot organize a national movement without knowing how organizations work. You cannot delegitimize a state without being fluent in the language the state uses to legitimize itself. The counter-elite can do all of that, because the state taught them how. That is the whole irony, and it is a very old one. The Qing taught Xiuquan to read and to write and to memorize a canon and to sit an examination, and he used that training to build a theocratic state with an army and a bureaucracy and an examination system of its own. He set his own exams. On the Bible, the surplus does not overthrow the machine. The surplus is trained by the machine in the operation of the machine, and then it builds a second machine and points it at the first one. Every mechanism I have just described requires 2 things: a promise and a wall. The promise creates the expectation. The wall blocks the delivery. And the size of the resulting problem is determined by the size of the crowd standing between them, which means that somewhere on Earth right now there is a society running this experiment at a scale that no state in history has ever attempted, with a crowd larger than any crowd that has ever been assembled for any purpose, and it is doing it deliberately, and it knows exactly what the numbers are, and about 2 years ago it stopped publishing them. In 2003, roughly 17% of Chinese high school graduates went on to higher education. By 2023, that figure was around 60%. That is one of the fastest expansions of elite formation in the history of the human species, and it was done on purpose. And by most reasonable moral standards, it was a magnificent thing to do. Hundreds of millions of people lifted out of subsistence agriculture within a single lifetime, and their children sent to university. There is no version of this story in which that is a bad thing to have wanted. Here is what it produced. In 2018, Chinese universities graduated about 7.5 million people. By 2023, that had risen to about 11.5 million. The projection for 2026 is somewhere around 12.5 to 13 million. 12.5 million graduates in 1 year from one country. That is more people than live in Belgium, credentialed and released into the labour market annually, and in June of 2023, the National Bureau of Statistics of China reported that urban unemployment among 16 to 24-year-olds had reached 21.3%. It was a record. It had been climbing for months, and every month the number came out, and every month it was worse. On the 15th of August, 2023, the National Bureau of Statistics announced that it would stop publishing the figure. The stated reason was that the methodology needed to be reviewed and improved, particularly with respect to whether students should be counted, which is a reasonable technical concern, and which is also, and I want to be careful about how I say this because I am not in the business of insinuation, precisely what you would do if the number were about to get worse and you would prefer that nobody watched. Before it went dark, an economist at Peking University named Zhang Dandan published an analysis in the financial magazine Caxin, arguing that the official figure was a substantial undercount. If you included the young people who had withdrawn from the labour market entirely, the ones who had gone home, the ones who had stopped looking, the ones the internet had started calling full-time children, then the real rate of young people in China who were not doing anything, she argued, could be as high as 46.5%. Her article was taken down. The series came back in January of 2024 with a new methodology that excludes students, and under the new definition the youth unemployment rate peaked at around 19% in the summer of 2025 and has been running in the mid-teens since, which is better than 46. It is not good. And it is being measured with a ruler that was rebuilt by the people being measured immediately after the old ruler gave an answer they did not like. And underneath the statistics there is a culture, and the culture is the most eloquent piece of evidence in this entire script, because it is the surplus describing itself, in its own words, in real time, in a way that no historian ever got to hear from the failed candidates of the Qing. They call it Taiping, lying flat. It emerged around 2021, and it is exactly what it sounds like. A refusal, not a protest, not a movement, not an organisation, and that is what makes it so much more disturbing than a protest would be. It is a mass withdrawal of effort by young, educated Chinese people who have looked at the arithmetic of their own lives, at the price of an apartment against the salary of a graduate job, at the hours demanded by an employer against the returns on offer, and have concluded that the entire proposition is a fraud and have simply stopped playing. There is a harsher version of it called Bai Lan, which translates as let it rot. Lie flat. Let it rot. These are not the slogans of a starving peasantry. These are the slogans of the most educated generation in the 4,000-year history of the country, and what they express is not deprivation. It is the specific chemically pure form of contempt that you only get from people who did everything correctly and got nothing, and who have worked out that the promise was a lie, and who are now in enormous numbers declining to participate. The Chinese state understands this perfectly. It has censored the terms. It has run propaganda campaigns against them. It has told young people to eat bitterness. It has been reduced in some genuinely surreal moments to publicly encouraging graduates to take jobs as farmers and factory workers, which is to say, to publicly encouraging its most credentialed citizens to walk back down the ladder it spent 30 years and unimaginable sums of money persuading them to climb. And they will not do it. Of course they will not do it. That is the entire point. A person does not spend 16 years of their life and their family's savings acquiring a credential in order to be told that the credential was a mistake, and would they mind going back to the village? The Qing tried this too. The imperial state periodically sold degrees for money, expanded quotas, invented honorary titles. Anything to relieve the pressure of the candidates it could not employ. It never worked, because you cannot buy off a status expectation with a lesser status. It is not a wage negotiation. There is no number. But China is the crowd. China is a very large crowd standing in front of a wall. The wall, at least, has always been the one thing you could rely on. Slow, stupid, structural, the number of offices in the bureaucracy, the number of seats in the firm. Institutions do not move quickly, and the whole of this literature, from Goldstone's index to Turchin's cycles, is built on the assumption that the number of elite positions in a society changes glacially, if it changes at all. Which is why what is happening right now, in the last 18 months, in the professional labour markets of the United States and Britain and everywhere else, is something that has no precedent in the 4,000-year record, and why I think everything I have told you so far may turn out to be the gentle part of this story. The wall has started moving. On the 28th of May, 2025, Dario Amodei, the chief executive of the artificial intelligence company Anthropic, gave an interview to Axios, in which he said that artificial intelligence could eliminate as much as half of all entry-level white-collar jobs and drive unemployment to somewhere between 10 and 20% within 1 to 5 years. He named the sectors. Technology, finance, law, consulting. Those are not 4 random industries. Those are the 4 terminal destinations of the entire modern elite credentialing pipeline. That is where the graduates of the selective universities go. That is what the debt was for. If you had asked a bright, ambitious 22-year-old in 2019 what the plan was, the answer would have been one of those 4 words, and Amodei is saying that half of the entry points to all 4 of them may be gone before that person turns 30. Now, chief executives of artificial intelligence companies have an obvious commercial interest in telling you that their product is world historically disruptive, and I do not think you should take Amodei's number at face value. And neither, I suspect, does he. It is a warning shaped like a sales pitch, or a sales pitch shaped like a warning, and the honest position is that nobody knows. But he is not the only source. And the other sources are not selling anything. The venture capital firm Signalfire went through the hiring data of the 15 largest technology companies in the United States. New graduate hiring at those firms fell by around a quarter between 2023 and 2024. New graduates, who made up around 15% of big technology hiring before the pandemic, now make up around 7%. And across job functions, roles for people with less than a year of post-graduation experience have fallen by roughly half over the period from 2019 to 2024. Researchers at Stanford working on digital economics found that employment for software developers aged 22 to 25 had fallen by around 20% from its peak in late 2022. Not employment overall, employment for the young ones. Entry-level employment in occupations most exposed to artificial intelligence has fallen by something in the order of 13% since 2022 while employment in the same occupations for experienced workers has held up or grown. The Burning Glass Institute went at it from the job posting side and found the same shape. The share of job postings requiring 3 years of experience or less has fallen sharply. In software development, from around 43% of postings to around 28%. In data analysis, from around 35 to 22%. In consulting, from around 41 to 26%. And the total number of postings did not collapse. The jobs are still there. They are just no longer being offered to anybody who has never had one. And one more number, from the signal firework, which is less rigorous than the others, and which I include anyway because of what it reveals about the psychology of the people doing the hiring. Roughly 37% of managers surveyed said they would rather use an artificial intelligence tool than hire a member of Generation Z. I want to be extremely careful here, because this is the point in the argument where it would be easy to cheat, and I have promised not to. Attributing this to artificial intelligence specifically is genuinely contested. The same period contains a post-pandemic hiring correction in technology, a sharp rise in interest rates that ended a decade of cheap capital and speculative hiring, and a general economic slowdown. Any competent labour economist will tell you that separating out the machine effect from those confounds is hard, and that the honest answer at this moment is that we do not yet know how much of this is the machine. Several of these studies are early, single source, and will be revised. That is the fair statement of the evidence. And I am making it because I want you to know that I am not manipulating you when I say the next thing. The next thing is that it does not actually matter. It does not matter, for the purposes of this theory, whether the bottom rung of the professional ladder is being sawn off by artificial intelligence, or by interest rates, or by a hiring correction, or by all three. What matters is whether it is being sawn off, and every independent source that has looked at it says the same thing. The entry-level positions in the highest status professions in the developed world are contracting sharply at exactly the moment when the largest and most expensively credentialed cohort in human history is arriving to fill them. Both curves are moving, and they are moving toward each other. Nothing in the historical record looks like this. In Stuart England, the number of church livings stayed roughly constant while the graduates piled up. In Qing, China, the number of offices stayed roughly constant while the candidates piled up. In Weimar, Germany, the professional positions contracted in a depression, which is the closest analogue we have. And that one produced the worst outcome in the history of the species. But in none of those cases was the contraction structural and permanent. The Weimar Depression ended. Church livings did not permanently disappear. What is being described now, if the strong version of it is true, is not a cyclical contraction in the number of elite positions. It is the permanent removal of the bottom rung of the ladder, which means the removal of the mechanism by which anybody gets onto the ladder at all, which means that within a generation, you would have a society with elite positions at the top and an enormous credentialed population at the bottom, and nothing whatsoever in between. That is not elite overproduction. That is a caste system with a university system attached to it as a decoration. And the promise stays on. That is the thing. The universities have not stopped recruiting. The tuition has not fallen. The graduation speeches have not changed a single word. The entire apparatus of expectation is still running at full power. Still telling 18-year-olds that if they work hard and get in and take on the debt there is a place waiting for them, and it is saying this into a labour market that is quietly, and without any announcement, closing the door those 18-year-olds are walking toward. I said at the start that I would keep putting the same question in front of you, and that I did not think it had an answer. Here it is again, for the last time. The surplus is countable. It has always been countable. Why has no society in the history of the world ever counted it and stopped. I think I know why now. I think I have known since about the third week of reading about this, and I have not wanted to write it down. It is because there is no acceptable answer. Go and look at what a society has to do to relieve the pressure. And look at the entire historical menu, and there are precisely 2 items on it. The first item is to stop the wealth pump, to force the returns of the economy back downward toward labour, through taxation, through unions, through wage compression, through whatever mechanism you like. Turchin thinks this is what the United States did in the middle of the 20th century, after the disorder of the 1890s and the crisis of the 1930s, and he thinks it worked, and he thinks it is the only known peaceful exit. It requires the wealthiest and most powerful people in a society to voluntarily surrender a very large amount of money and status, in the present, in order to prevent a statistical catastrophe that a mathematical model says might happen at some point in the coming decades. Look around and tell me how you rate the odds. And the second item, the one that history has actually reached for, essentially every single time, is the other kind of solution. The surplus is not absorbed, the surplus is destroyed. Revolution, civil war, purge, terror, expulsion, elites are killed, or they are exiled, or they are declared no longer to be elites, and the ratio is restored by subtraction. The French Revolution reduced the number of French elites by killing them. The Taiping Rebellion reduced the number of Chinese aspirants by killing 20 million people, most of them entirely uninvolved. The English Civil War killed a share of the male population greater than the First World War, and in each case the arithmetic did, eventually, resolve. The ratio came back into line. The theory works. That is the horror at the centre of this thing, and it is why I think nobody has ever acted on it. It is not that societies fail to see the number. It is that seeing the number does not help, because the only cures available are either politically impossible or morally unspeakable, and so the rational thing for any individual actor inside the system to do is to look away and hope that the crisis arrives on somebody else's watch. The Qing scholar officials could have counted the candidates. They were the candidates who had won. Restricting the examinations would have meant admitting that the ladder they had climbed was a fiction for almost everybody behind them, and they were not going to do that, because their own legitimacy rested on it. And no Harvard admissions officer is going to publish a report explaining that the true function of a 3% acceptance rate is the industrial manufacture of resentment. No law school dean is going to stand up and say that most of the people in the lecture theatre are on the wrong side of the canyon and always were. No university is going to tell an 18-year-old the truth, which is that the Credential is now a lottery ticket sold at the price of a house. They cannot say it. Their entire institutional existence is the promise. And you cannot say it either, and that is the last thing, and then I will stop. Because I have been describing a population to you for 2 hours as though it were a weather system, and it is not a weather system, and you know that, and I know that, and there is a specific reason this material is so hard to think about clearly. And the reason is that almost everybody who is capable of understanding this argument is inside the thing the argument is about. If you have a degree, you are in the count. If you have a degree and a job that does not require it, you are in the count in the specific technical sense that the Federal Reserve Bank of New York uses when it publishes that quarterly number. If you did everything right and ended up somewhere adjacent to the thing you were promised, doing work that is a little smaller than the work you trained for, telling yourself that it is fine, that it is temporary, that you are still building towards something, you are not having a personal problem. You are a data point in a series. There are tens of millions of you. The series is going up. And the reason that is unbearable to look at directly is not that it is depressing, it is that it removes the story you have been telling yourself about your own life. because the story is that it was your fault, or that it was bad luck, or that you should have picked a different major, or that you should have networked harder, or that you should have been born 4 years earlier when the market was better. And every one of those explanations is personal and manageable and preserves the idea that the system is basically sound and you simply did not get through it optimally. The structural explanation takes that away. The structural explanation says that a certain number of people were always going to end up where you are, that the number was set before you were born by ratios you had no part in creating, and that if it had not been you, it would have been somebody exactly like you, and that your entire strategic life, the studying, the applications, the internships, the debt, was a rational response to a promise that had already been mathematically falsified by the time you were old enough to hear it. Nobody can carry that around. It is much easier to believe you should have gone to law school. And this in the end is why the surplus never gets counted, and I want to say this as plainly as I can. It is not that the number is hidden. The number is published. It is that the number can only be seen by the people it is about, and those are precisely the people who cannot afford to believe it, because to believe it is to accept that the most disciplined years of their lives were spent competing in an examination whose pass rate was set by arithmetic they never saw long before they sat down. Xiuquan sat down 4 times. I keep going back to the compound. Rows and rows of brick cells, 3 feet wide, thousands of them, stretching away in the heat, each one containing one man with a board across his knees, writing an essay in a form that had not changed in centuries. And every single one of those men was, by the standards of his society, correct. He had done the correct thing. He had studied the correct texts. He had presented himself at the correct place on the correct day, and paid the correct fee, and taken his correct seat. There is not one thing you could point to in the life of the man in the next cell, or the one after that, or the one after that, and say, there, that is where he went wrong. They were all right, and almost all of them lost, because the compound was built with more cells than the empire had chairs, and it was built that way on purpose, because a state that wants legitimacy must be seen to be open to everybody, and a state that wants stability must give power to almost nobody, and the examination compound is the machine that reconciles those two requirements by producing, on a fixed schedule, an enormous number of people who cannot blame anybody but themselves. Until they can. The thing that happened to Xiuquan on the 4th failure was not that he went mad. He had already gone mad, 6 years earlier, quietly, on a bamboo litter on the road home. What happened on the 4th failure was that he found an explanation. He picked up a pamphlet and he found a story in which his failure was not his failure, in which the fault lay with the demons who had usurped the empire, and in which he personally had been selected by the highest possible authority for a role commensurate with what he had always known he was worth. That is what an ideology is. That is all an ideology has ever been. It is the thing that arrives always on schedule and tells the surplus that it was never their fault, and there is always one available. There was one in Paris in the 1780s, sold in the garrets. There was one in Germany in 1931, and the students got to it 2 years before anybody else. There will be one for whatever is coming, and it will be tailored with great precision to the specific grievances of the specific people who did everything correctly and were told no, and it will be written by people who are extremely good at writing, because that is what they were trained for, and it will be distributed on infrastructure they built, because that is also what they were trained for. The numbers are all published. The New York Fed updates in 3 months. The next admission cycle will produce a lower acceptance rate than the last one, and the university will put it in a press release. The next graduating class will be larger than any class in history, and the ratio between what those people have been promised and what exists for them to have is going to be. On every measure anybody currently knows how to take, worse than the year before. None of this is a prediction. I want to be completely clear about that, because I have spent 2 hours telling you why the predictions do not hold. The theory is loose. The proxies are contaminated. The counterexamples are real, and they have not been answered. Societies with all of these indicators have held together before, and they may hold together again. And if you want to bet on the durability of the institutions, the 1960s are a perfectly respectable place to plant your flag. But there is one thing the critics have never touched, and it is the only thing I have left, and I have not found a way around it. In every case where this ended badly, the numbers were there in advance. Not the outcome, never the outcome, just the count. The enrolment figures, the degree awards, the wage series, the admissions ratios, dry and public and available to anybody who cared to add them up. And in every single case, the people who could have added them up were the people the numbers were about. They were sitting in the cells. The state does not need to hide the arithmetic of the examination compound. It never has. It can leave the registers open on a table by the gate, and the candidates will walk past them 4 times over 16 years, and not one of them will stop and count, because to count would be to know. And to know would be to have to explain to your father why you are coming home. You already know your number. You have known it for years. You just call it something else.